Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and fellow citizens. Tonight, we stand at a crossroads where truth collides with power, and transparency demands its rightful place in the heart of our democracy. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett took to national television and revealed a previously undisclosed Supreme Court memo, the air in the nation shifted. The moment was not merely political theater. It was a revelation, a flash of accountability that left even the highest chambers of justice trembling. For generations, the Supreme Court of the United States has stood as the most revered institution in our democracy, a place where law, reason, and morality converge to safeguard the liberties of the American people. Yet, beneath the solemn robes and marble columns lies an uncomfortable truth. Tradition has often served as both a shield and a silence. When we speak of transparency over tradition, we are calling for a shift in the very foundation of how justice is seen, spoken, and delivered. This principle is not about diminishing respect for the court. It is about strengthening the trust that gives the court its legitimacy. Without transparency, tradition becomes a curtain that hides accountability. With transparency, it becomes a bridge that connects authority to the people it serves. The recent revelation of a Supreme Court memo by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett has reignited this debate in a way few moments in modern history have. When that document surfaced, live, before a national audience, it did more than expose words written in secrecy. It exposed the tension between two ideals: the preservation of institutional dignity and the necessity of public oversight. Brett Kavanaugh's visible unease during that revelation was not just a personal reaction. It was symbolic of a system grappling with the light of public scrutiny after too long in the shadows. For decades, the Supreme Court has operated under a veil of confidentiality justified by tradition, but today's America is no longer willing to accept secrecy as a substitute for integrity. Transparency does not mean the abandonment of decorum or the compromise of judicial independence. Rather, it means allowing the public to understand the reasoning, ethics, and internal checks that shape decisions impacting millions of lives. When rulings affect reproductive rights, voting access, or corporate influence, the people deserve to know whether justice was applied without prejudice or hidden influence. The exposure of the memo hinted at internal deliberations that may not align with public statements. A discovery that reignited questions about how transparent our justices truly are about their conflicts of interest and guiding philosophies. This is not an attack on the court, it is a call to renew its moral contract with the nation. Tradition tells us that the Supreme Court must remain insulated from public pressure to maintain impartiality. But transparency tells us that impartiality cannot exist without accountability. When information about ethical violations, undisclosed gifts, or private communications comes to light, the defense of tradition too often becomes a convenient excuse to avoid change. The public is not asking to sit in on judicial conferences or to politicize verdicts. What the public is asking for is clarity. Clarity on how justices interpret the law, how they manage conflicts, and how they uphold the ethical standards expected of every other public servant in America. Transparency, in this sense, is not the enemy of justice. It is its greatest ally. It is easy to romanticize the Supreme Court as a sacred institution, untouched by the turbulence of political life. But even the most sacred institutions require reform when they lose sight of their purpose. The framers of our Constitution never intended for the judiciary to exist in isolation. They envisioned a balance of powers where accountability and transparency would sustain each branch of government. Tradition, while important, was never meant to eclipse the people's right to know how their justice system functions. In today's interconnected, information-driven society, secrecy breeds suspicion. Every hidden memo, every undisclosed influence erodes public trust. And when trust fades, the authority of the court weakens. Not because of external criticism, but because of internal resistance to openness. Transparency over tradition means reimagining what judicial respect looks like in the 21st century. Respect today is not built on mystique or distance. It is built on honesty and accessibility. When citizens see their leaders and institutions as open, ethical, and accountable, they engage with faith instead of skepticism. Imagine a Supreme Court where ethical disclosures are routine, where justices willingly explain the reasoning behind controversial recusals, and where internal memos, like the one revealed by Jasmine Crockett, are no longer shocking because transparency is already the norm. That is not a fantasy. That is the next evolution of democracy. The reaction to the memo's revelation, Kavanaugh's visible discomfort, the media's frenzy, the public's outrage, shows that secrecy can no longer coexist with the expectations of modern governance. The American people are not asking for perfection, they are asking for truth. And truth, by nature, does not thrive in darkness. If the court wishes to preserve its prestige, it must embrace a new kind of tradition, one rooted not in secrecy, but in service. It must remember that its power comes not from tradition alone, but from the consent and confidence of the governed. Transparency also serves a higher moral purpose. It compels those in power to act conscientiously, knowing their actions can withstand public examination. When the people can see the process, when decisions are made in the light, integrity becomes a natural outcome, not an optional performance. Justice Kavanaugh's panic, whether emotional or symbolic, underscores the discomfort that comes when truth challenges power. But discomfort is not destruction, it is transformation. It is the necessary pain of growth, the evidence that change is underway. So when we say, transparency over tradition, we are not rejecting the wisdom of the past. We are honoring it by making it relevant to the present. We are affirming that justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done. The court's authority will not weaken under transparency. It will strengthen, for its power will once again be rooted in the trust of the people. In the end, transparency is not about exposure. It is about enlightenment. It is about proving that the highest court in the land is still accountable to the highest authority of all the truth. And as long as leaders like Jasmine Crockett continue to demand that truth be seen and heard, the pursuit of justice in America will remain not just a tradition, but a living, breathing testament to democracy itself. Accountability in power is not merely a political slogan. It is the heartbeat of democracy. When power is concentrated in the hands of a few without oversight, justice becomes vulnerable to corruption, and truth becomes a matter of convenience rather than principle. The revelation of the Supreme Court memo by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett reignited one of the most vital conversations in modern American history. How do we ensure that even the most powerful figures, those seated at the highest levels of government and justice, remain answerable to the people they serve? This question lies at the very core of what it means to be a democratic nation. For when accountability fades, freedom falters. Brett Kavanaugh's reaction to the public unveiling of that confidential memo symbolized more than personal discomfort. It embodied the struggle of an institution unaccustomed to scrutiny. For decades, the Supreme Court has existed above the fray, insulated from political storms, revered as a near, mystical body whose decisions shape every facet of American life. Yet this reverence has come at a cost. The same insulation that was meant to protect judicial independence has too often shielded justices from consequences. When Crockett revealed that Memo live on national television, she did not just challenge one man, she challenged the very culture of immunity that has long surrounded the nation's highest court. Accountability must never be seen as an act of defiance. It is an act of preservation. It safeguards the very legitimacy of power. When citizens see their leaders held responsible for their words, actions, and decisions, faith in governance is strengthened. When those in power are allowed to operate in secrecy, the fabric of trust begins to unravel. The Supreme Court, like all branches of government, derives its authority not from divine right or untouchable tradition, but from the Constitution, and ultimately, from the consent of the governed. If the governed begin to doubt the honesty and integrity of their guardians of justice, the foundation of that consent begins to erode. True accountability does not seek to humiliate or punish, it seeks to illuminate. It asks questions that demand clarity, not confrontation. The memo revealed by Jasmine Crockett reportedly hinted at inconsistencies between public statements and private deliberations, a discovery that fueled public suspicion. The public was not enraged simply because the memo existed. They were outraged because it suggested a breach of trust. Accountability demands that when discrepancies arise between what is said and what is done, Those discrepancies must be addressed openly, not hidden behind closed doors in the name of judicial discretion. Transparency without accountability is hollow, and tradition without responsibility is dangerous. The principle of accountability is not limited to the judiciary. It applies to every seat of power, from Congress to the Oval Office. Yet, when it comes to the Supreme Court, accountability is often viewed as a threat to independence, rather than a reinforcement of integrity. This perception must change. Independence should not mean invisibility. A justice can remain impartial while still being held to ethical standards, just as a legislator can serve without corruption. When power is unchecked, even the noblest institutions can drift from their purpose. History has shown us time and again that corruption does not begin with greed. It begins with the belief that one is untouchable. In an age of increasing political polarization, the cry for accountability has never been louder or more necessary. The people are no longer satisfied with vague assurances or carefully worded press releases. They want evidence of integrity, not declarations of it. They want to see that the same laws, which govern ordinary citizens, also apply to those who interpret them. When leaders in power, especially within the judiciary, face no consequences for misconduct or ethical lapses, it sends a dangerous message that justice is conditional, not universal. And that message strikes at the very soul of democracy. Jasmine Crockett's revelation was more than a political statement. It was a moral act. It reminded the nation that accountability is not an attack. It is an affirmation that democracy still works. Her courage forced the country to confront a truth. Many preferred to ignore that unchecked power, no matter how noble its origin, eventually corrodes the system it was meant to protect. The discomfort seen in Brett Kavanaugh's reaction is not unique to him. It represents the unease of any institution suddenly reminded that it must answer to the people. We often hear that the Supreme Court must remain above politics. That is true. But being above politics does not mean being beyond accountability. When a justice's decisions, financial dealings, or ethical conduct come under question, there must be a transparent and consistent process for investigation, just as there is for any other public official. Accountability should not depend on media pressure or political scandal. It should be built into the structure of the institution itself. Because when accountability is proactive, trust grows naturally. When it is reactive, damage has already been done. At its heart, accountability is about balance. The balance between authority and answerability, between independence and responsibility. No one, regardless of title, should wield power without the burden of justification. And no system that fears accountability can ever truly claim to serve justice. As citizens, we must reject the false dichotomy that holding power to account undermines it. On the contrary, it refines it. Accountability ensures that those who lead us, judge us, and govern us remain human in the eyes of the law and the people. It ensures that justice is not merely pronounced, but practiced. As we reflect on this moment, on Jasmine Crockett's boldness and Brett Kavanaugh's unease, we must recognize that this is not an ending, but a beginning. A democracy that cannot question its most powerful figures is not a democracy at all, it is a performance. Real power is not in avoiding scrutiny, but in enduring it and emerging stronger. Accountability is not a punishment for power, it is the proof of its legitimacy. In the end, history will not remember who panicked or who stayed calm in that moment of revelation. It will remember who demanded honesty, who fought for transparency, and who stood up for the belief that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law. That is the essence of accountability in power, and that is the promise every American deserves to see fulfilled. Courage in leadership is not measured by titles, power, or prestige. It is measured by the willingness to stand for truth when silence is safer. In a time when politics has become a battlefield of caution and calculation, true courage has become a rare and precious currency. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett chose to reveal that Supreme Court memo on national television, she embodied a kind of leadership that transcends party lines and personal risk. Her act was not born out of ambition, it was born out of duty. It was a moment that reminded the nation that real leaders are not those who seek comfort in conformity, but those who risk everything to confront the uncomfortable. The moment she held that memo before the nation's eyes, the air shifted. It was not merely a revelation, it was a reckoning. Here was a public servant willing to defy political decorum in order to protect public trust. That is the essence of courage in leadership. To recognize that some truths are too important to be hidden, even if revealing them shakes the foundations of power. Brett Kavanaugh's reaction, the panic that flickered across his expression, was a testament to the force of that truth. Power often fears courage because courage is immune to intimidation. It cannot be bribed, coerced, or silenced. Courage stands as the last defense of democracy when systems fail and institutions falter. True leadership requires the courage to act not when it is easy, but when it is dangerous. Jasmine Crockett's decision to speak openly about the memo could have subjected her to immense political backlash, personal attacks, and institutional criticism. Yet, she understood that silence would cost the nation far more than it would cost her career. In a time when many leaders choose convenience over conviction, her bravery stood out as a clarion call, a reminder that the purpose of holding office is not to preserve one's position, but to protect the people's right to truth. Leadership without courage is merely management. Courage transforms leadership into service. Courage in leadership also demands an ability to face isolation. Those who stand for principle often find themselves standing alone. History's most revered leaders, those who shaped progress and challenged corruption, were not celebrated in their time. They were ridiculed, resisted, and reviled before they were ever respected. Courage is not about being fearless, it is about feeling fear and doing what is right anyway. When Crockett revealed that memo, she was not simply exposing a document, she was exposing a mindset. A mindset that believes power is safest when unchallenged. Her defiance broke that illusion and reignited a conversation that America desperately needed to have. Who holds the powerful accountable when they believe they answer to no one? The courage of one leader can awaken courage in others. It can spark a chain reaction of honesty that no scandal or secrecy can suppress. Leadership by courage is contagious. It inspires others to question, to demand, to act. When the public witnessed Crockett's determination, many saw in her a reflection of their own frustration with the lack of transparency and ethical responsibility among those in power. Her courage validated the public's voice, proving that integrity still has a place in governance. It reminded citizens that leadership is not reserved for those with titles or offices. It begins with anyone brave enough to speak truth to power. But courage in leadership also requires wisdom. It is not reckless defiance or loud protest for its own sake. It is guided by discernment, rooted in purpose, and directed toward justice. Crockett's actions were deliberate, not impulsive. She understood the gravity of her revelation and the responsibility it carried. This is what separates true courage from mere bravado. Real courage does not seek attention. It seeks accountability. It is not about destroying institutions. It is about strengthening them through honesty. Her act, though controversial, aimed to restore what had been lost: the people's faith that their leaders would defend truth, even when it is inconvenient. The challenge with courage is that it demands sacrifice. Every act of courage carries a cost. Whether it is reputation, safety, or stability, leaders who choose courage often pay a price for their conviction. But that is the price of progress. Without courage, corruption festers. Without courage, injustice hides behind procedure. And without courage, democracy becomes a hollow performance. The Supreme Court, like any institution of power, must be reminded that its strength does not lie in secrecy or tradition, but in the moral courage of those who serve it. The revelation of the memo was more than a disruption. It was a mirror reflecting the fear that comes when truth finally arrives. Courage also exposes hypocrisy. It challenges the notion that authority equals righteousness. When Brett Kavanaugh appeared rattled by the disclosure, it showed how deeply ingrained the expectation of deference to power has become. Yet, courage in leadership refuses to bow to hierarchy. It insists that accountability must flow upward as well as downward. It asks uncomfortable questions and refuses to be satisfied with convenient answers. This is why courageous leaders are often controversial. They challenge comfort, and comfort resists change. But without discomfort, there can be no growth, no reform, no progress. In a nation yearning for integrity, courage in leadership offers hope. It tells every citizen that truth still matters, that ethics are not outdated, and that justice is still worth fighting for. Jasmine Crockett's decision may have unsettled the powerful, but it reassured the powerless. It reminded the public that courage is not just an individual act. It is a collective inheritance. Every time one person dares to speak out, they carve a path for others to follow. And when enough people walk that path, the system begins to change. At its core, courage in leadership is about faith. Faith in the people, faith in the truth, and faith in the enduring promise of democracy. It is about believing that integrity will outlast deception, and that the courage to reveal truth is the purest form of patriotism. In that moment on national television, Jasmine Crockett did not just confront injustice, she confronted the culture of fear that keeps leaders silent. And in doing so, she reminded America that leadership without courage is powerless. But courage, even without authority, can move a nation. Restoring public trust is not just a political necessity, it is a moral imperative. A nation's strength is not measured solely by the size of its economy, its military, or its technological progress. It is measured by the faith of its people in the fairness of their institutions. When that faith erodes, every system built upon it begins to crumble from within. In recent years, America has witnessed a steady decline in public confidence in its highest institutions: Congress, the presidency, and now, the Supreme Court. The revelation of the Supreme Court Memo by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was not merely an act of political courage. It was a desperate cry to restore that fading trust. It was a reminder that democracy cannot function if the people no longer believe that justice is impartial, transparent, and accountable. When that memo was unveiled, it shocked the conscience of the nation. It forced citizens to ask a painful question. If the very court entrusted with upholding truth hides behind secrecy and internal contradiction, where can the people turn for justice? Brett Kavanaugh's visible unease during that broadcast moment symbolized more than a personal discomfort. It reflected an institution confronting its own credibility crisis. For decades, the Supreme Court has been revered as the guardian of fairness and reason, the ultimate arbiter of constitutional truth. Yet, as controversies surrounding ethical conduct, undisclosed financial ties, and partisan influence have emerged, the once unshakable faith of the American people has begun to waver. The court may still command authority, but authority without trust is fragile. Restoring public trust begins with honesty. It begins with the acknowledgement that the gap between the people and their institutions has grown too wide, and that trust cannot be demanded, it must be earned. Trust is not built through eloquent statements or symbolic gestures, it is built through consistent transparency and accountability. The exposure of that memo was unsettling, yes, but sometimes the truth must first shake us before it can steady us. In that moment, Jasmine Crockett did not weaken the court. She challenged it to rise to a higher standard. She held up a mirror, and what was reflected was uncomfortable but necessary, a reminder that even the most powerful institutions must answer to the people who give them their legitimacy. Public trust thrives in light and dies in darkness. The Supreme Court, more than any other institution, should understand that principle. For a body that interprets the Constitution, the very document that promises equality and justice for all, it must hold itself to the same ideals it enforces. Yet in recent years, secrecy and partisanship have cast long shadows over its decisions. The perception that justices are influenced by ideology rather than law, or that ethics rules do not apply to them, as they do to other public servants, has created a crisis of confidence. The American people are not naive, they understand that justices are human. What they cannot accept is hypocrisy disguised as honor, or favoritism cloaked in formality. To restore trust, the court must embrace transparency not as an act of concession, but as a declaration of integrity. Restoring trust also requires humility from those in power. It means admitting that mistakes have been made, that reforms are necessary, and that credibility is not a birthright. It is a responsibility renewed every day through honest conduct. Imagine the transformation if, instead of defensiveness, the court responded to revelations like Crockett's with reflection. If it said, "Yes, we are not above scrutiny. Yes, the people deserve clarity. Yes, we will open our processes to greater oversight." That single act of humility would do more to restore faith than any speech or public statement. For humility is not weakness, it is wisdom. The wisdom to know that power without accountability is unsustainable. But the task of restoring public trust does not rest solely on the shoulders of the court. It belongs to every branch of government, every leader, and every citizen. Jasmine Crockett's courage served as a spark, but it is up to the collective conscience of the nation to turn that spark into lasting reform. The media must report with accuracy and integrity. Lawmakers must legislate with transparency. Citizens must engage with awareness and demand honesty, not as partisans, but as patriots. Trust is not restored through outrage alone. It is rebuilt through action, through commitment, through truth. Restoring trust also means redefining justice as something not only administered in courtrooms, but lived in communities. When citizens see fairness in how laws are applied, when they see accountability for the powerful and compassion for the powerless, their trust grows. When they see leaders prioritize the nation's well-being over personal gain, hope returns. The exposure of the memo may have temporarily deepened cynicism, but in the long term, it offers an opportunity, a turning point where transparency can give birth to transformation. What begins as a scandal can end as a renewal if we have the courage to confront what it reveals. In many ways, public trust is like glass once shattered. It can be repaired, but the cracks will always remain visible. The only way to prevent further fractures is through constant care. Institutions must act not only within the bounds of the law, but within the expectations of conscience. The people must see justice, not as an abstraction, but as a living promise, one that is honored through deeds, not words. That is what Jasmine Crockett's revelation demanded: not destruction, but restoration, not chaos but clarity, not shame but sincerity. At its heart, the effort to restore public trust is about healing. It is about healing the rift between the governed and the governing, between those who interpret the law and those who live under it. It is about reminding the nation that justice is not a privilege of the powerful. It is the birthright of every citizen. When Brett Kavanaugh panicked in that moment, it was not simply fear of exposure, it was fear of reckoning. But reckoning is not the enemy of justice. It is its renewal. For only when institutions are held accountable can they truly be worthy of the public's trust again. In the end, restoring trust will require more than apologies. It will require transformation. It will require leaders who put truth before politics, and institutions that put people before pride. Jasmine Crockett's boldness has already shown the first step. The rest is up to those who follow, to choose transparency over secrecy, integrity over image, and accountability over authority. When that day comes, and the people once again believe that justice serves them all, then America will not just be a democracy in name. It will be a democracy in truth. In the end, this moment will be remembered not for who panicked, but for who stood tall. The exposure of that memo was not a scandal, it was a spark. It reminded America that truth, though sometimes uncomfortable, is the foundation upon which our democracy stands. And as long as there are voices brave enough to reveal it, justice will never truly be silenced.